There's a bank in Hicksville, Long Island that most people drive past without a second look. Strip mall on one side, gas station across the street. Nothing about it says history happened here. But for roughly 16 years, from somewhere around 1984 until the year 2000, inside a safety deposit box in that ordinary bank sat a 2,000-year-old secret. Nobody was guarding it. Nobody even remembered it was there. When the bank finally forced the box open, the key didn't turn anymore. They had to call a locksmith. Inside, a stack of papyrus, so brittle it looked like burnt paper. A text so old, so fragile that just breathing on it wrong could turn 2,000 years of survival into dust in your hand. That text had a name. The people who condemned it nearly 2,000 years ago gave it that name themselves in the act of trying to destroy it. The Gospel of Judas. Not Judas the traitor everyone was taught to hate. Judas, in this account, was following instructions. Direct instructions. From Jesus himself. I need you to sit with that for a second because I sat with it a long time before I could say it out loud. Everything I taught for 12 years about who the villain of that story was, I taught it in a Catholic school to freshman history students with total confidence, might be sitting on a single mistranslated word or a single decision made by men in power a very long time after anyone who actually knew Judas was still alive to argue back. Some secrets don't get buried in vaults built to hide them. They just get forgotten. In ordinary ones. A bank box in a strip mall. Nobody hid this text. Everybody just stopped looking for it. And that, it turns out, might be worse. Before I go further, if you're new to this channel, this is where we go looking in the boxes nobody's paid to open anymore. The suppressed manuscripts, the condemned gospels, the documents an institution decided you didn't need to see. Hit like on this video and subscribe. It's the only way YouTube tells me this kind of digging is worth funding, and it's what lets me keep opening boxes like this one for you. I'm Nathan. 12 years ago, I was teaching this exact story to teenagers in Evansville, Indiana, in a classroom with a crucifix on the wall, and I told it exactly the way I was taught it. Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold his teacher for 30 pieces of silver, kissed him on the cheek to identify him to the soldiers, and then, sick with guilt, hanged himself in a field. The worst human being in the New Testament. The name that became a synonym for betrayal in dozens of languages. That's the version everyone knows. That's the version I taught with total confidence. Here's what I didn't know when I was teaching it. Here's what most people still don't know. Let's build the official version properly first, because you need to feel how solid it is before I show you the crack in it. 4 Gospels, 4 separate accounts, written across roughly 30 to 70 years after the events they describe, by 4 different communities in at least 2 different regions of the Mediterranean world. And on this one point, they agree with unusual consistency. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 men closest to Jesus, arranged to hand him over to the religious authorities for a payment of 30 pieces of silver. He identified Jesus to the arresting soldiers with a kiss, a signal prearranged in the darkness of a garden called Gethsemane, so the guards would know which man in the group to seize. The Gospel of Matthew adds a final detail. Overcome with remorse, Judas returned the silver, threw it onto the temple floor, and hanged himself. For 2,000 years, that has been the moral center of Holy Week. Judas is not just a minor antagonist. He is, in Western culture, the archetype of betrayal itself. Dante placed him in the lowest circle of his inferno, not with murderers, not with heretics, but at the very center of hell, frozen waist-deep in ice, being chewed for eternity in one of the 3 mouths of Satan himself, alongside Brutus and Cassius, the men who killed Julius Caesar. Da Vinci painted him recoiling into shadow at the Last Supper, the only disciple whose face the light doesn't reach. His name became a word, in English, in Spanish, in French, in a dozen languages. Judas doesn't mean a man who made a bad decision. It means traitor. It means the worst thing a human being can be to someone who trusted him. I taught all of this. I taught the theology behind it too, that Judas's betrayal fulfilled prophecy, that his greed made him a cautionary tale, that free will meant he chose this. Damned himself with his own hand, sold out God for a sum of money that wouldn't have covered a decent burial plot. It is, without question, one of the most stable stories in all of Christian tradition, which is exactly why what I found should not have been possible. I remember, early in my teaching career, picking up a used seminary textbook at a library sale for $2 because the cover was falling off and nobody else wanted it. It was a survey of early Christian heresies, the kind of dry academic catalog most people would never open voluntarily. There was a single paragraph buried in a chapter on 2nd century Gnostic sects about a group called the Cainites. The footnote said they venerated Cain, the Old Testament's first murderer. It said they venerated Esau. And it said, almost as an aside, like the author wanted to get through it quickly, that they venerated Judas too, and that they possessed a gospel written in his name. I read that paragraph, closed the book, and didn't think about it again for over a decade. It read like a footnote about a fringe group of ancient weirdos. That's exactly how it was written to read. I didn't understand back then that I was looking at the fossil record of a suppression. I thought I was looking at a curiosity. Here's what that footnote didn't tell me, and what I only pieced together years later. That group and that gospel weren't invented by fringe Gnostics scribbling nonsense in the dark. We know they existed because a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyons sat down around the year 180 and wrote a detailed refutation of them. By name. Irenaeus wasn't a marginal figure. He's one of the foundational voices of Orthodox Christianity, a student of the Apostle John by his own account. And his multi-volume work against heresies is one of our most important windows into the early church. Somewhere in Lyon, by lamplight, he dictated to a scribe who copied every word onto fresh parchment meant to outlive them both. And it did. In Book 1, Chapter 31, he describes a sect he calls the Cainites, people who honored Cain, Esau, Korah, and Judas, believing that each of them had secretly carried out God's will, even though the mainstream tradition condemned them. And here is the sentence that stopped me cold when I finally read it in the original. Irenaeus records that the Cainites taught that Judas, alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. Alone. Knowing the truth as no others did. Do the math with me for a second, because the math is the whole point. Jesus was crucified somewhere around the year 30. Irenaeus is writing around 180. That means this alternate account, Judas, as the one disciple who understood the mission, not the one who destroyed it, was already old enough, established enough, widespread enough, that a bishop felt he had to write a formal, point-by-point refutation of it, within a century and a half of the crucifixion. Maybe less, if the tradition Irenaeus is refuting had already been circulating for a generation or two before he got around to writing about it, which is exactly how heresies typically reach a bishop's desk. They get refuted after they've already spread, not before. The first written record we have of the Gospel of Judas isn't the Gospel itself. It's someone trying to kill it. Think about what that means. The very first mention of this text in the historical record is an act of institutional suppression. So the natural question is, okay, but did the actual text survive? Did anyone ever find the thing Irenaeus was so worried about? Or did his refutation work and it just disappeared? For 1800 years, the answer seemed to be no. The text Irenaeus described was assumed lost, one more casualty of a war the winners got to write the history of. And then, in the late 1970s, In the desert near a town called El Minya in Middle Egypt, antiquities looters broke into an ancient burial cave. What they found inside was a leather-bound codex, a book, not a scroll, made of papyrus pages bound together, written in Coptic, the language of Christian Egypt in late antiquity. Nobody who found it that day had any idea what it actually was. To them, it was just old, and old things sell. In the antiquities trade, especially in that era, old and sellable is a currency all its own. What followed reads less like an archaeological discovery and more like a hostage situation that lasted over 20 years. The codex disappeared into the black market, changing hands among dealers who understood its financial value and had no interest in or capacity for its scholarly one. At some point in the early 1980s, the exact date is genuinely uncertain, which tells you something about how this manuscript traveled. It ended up in a safety deposit box in a bank in Hicksville on Long Island, New York. And there it stayed. Not for a year, not for 5. For roughly 16 years, through the 1980s and into the 1990s, while the papyrus inside sat in the dark, in fluctuating humidity, slowly deteriorating in a way that no one was there to prevent. At one point during those lost years, Yale University was given the chance to evaluate it. A Yale expert examined the fragments and was reportedly the first person in the modern era to recognize what he was looking at: a Coptic copy of the very Gospel of Judas that Irenaeus had denounced by name 18 centuries earlier. Yale had the opportunity to acquire the most significant Gnostic manuscript discovery since the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945. Yale said no. The ownership history was too murky, too entangled in the antiquities black market for a major university to touch it. So it went back into the dark, back into the box, for years more. In April of the year 2000, a Zurich-based antiquities dealer named Frida Nussberger Chakos finally purchased it, which is why it now carries her name, the Codex Chakos. She understood, or came to understand, that she was holding something extraordinary. What she did next should have destroyed it completely. Months after acquiring the Codex, Nussberger Chakos transferred it to an American dealer named Bruce Farini for further evaluation. Farini made a decision that, if you know anything about the conservation of ancient organic material, will make you wince. He stored the fragile 2,000-year-old papyrus in a freezer. I want you to actually picture this. Papyrus is a plant fiber. It survives for millennia in the bone-dry conditions of the Egyptian desert precisely because there is no moisture to destroy it. Freeze it, and the moisture that inevitably exists inside the fibers expands into ice crystals. The ink, sitting on the surface for 2,000 years, begins to separate from the material underneath it. The pages darken. What 16 years in a bank vault had already weakened, a freezer very nearly finished off. Farini went bankrupt not long after. When the Codex was finally returned to Nussberger Chakos in 2001, pages were missing. Simply gone. Sold off separately. Lost, unaccounted for, during Farini's financial collapse. The restoration expert who examined it that year, a Swiss Coptologist named Rodolphe Kasser, described what he was looking at in blunt terms. Partially pulverized, infinitely fragile, crumbling at the least contact. What had once been a book was now something closer to 1,000 separate fragments, some no larger than a fingernail, that had to be painstakingly matched back together like the most fragile, highest-stakes jigsaw puzzle imaginable. A Swiss organization called the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art, based in Basel, took on the restoration. It took years. Kasser worked alongside a team that eventually included Marvin Meyer, a Gnosticism specialist at Chapman University, and Gregor Wurst from the University of Augsburg, 3 of the leading Coptic scholars in the world, spending years reassembling a manuscript that a dealer had nearly destroyed by accident, that a bank had nearly destroyed through neglect, that looters had ripped from the ground in the first place with no idea what they were holding. On April 6, 2006, National Geographic finally unveiled it to the world. The documentary aired 3 days later on April 9th, and I want you to sit with that date, because it wasn't random. April 9th, 2006 was Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week, the single week on the Christian calendar most focused on the story of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion, the week that includes in the traditional liturgy the reading of the Passion, in which Judas plays the villain. National Geographic timed the reveal of a document that potentially rewrites Judas's role to land at the exact moment in the calendar when the traditional version of that story is read aloud in churches around the world. That's not an accident. That's a media company that understood exactly what it was sitting on. So what did it actually say? What was worth risking a freezer, a bankruptcy, a fistfight in the antiquities market, and a Palm Sunday broadcast to reveal? The translation team, Kasser, Meyer, and Wurst, read a text in which Jesus pulls Judas aside privately away from the other 11 disciples and tells him something none of the others are meant to hear. In their reading, Jesus says to Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Sacrifice the man that clothes me. Read that again. In this translation, Jesus isn't describing betrayal. He's describing his physical body, the man that clothes me, as something to be released, sacrificed, so that whatever Jesus actually is underneath it can complete its mission. And he's not accusing Judas of a future crime. He's giving him an assignment. According to this reading, of the 12 men who followed Jesus for years, sat at his table, watched him heal and teach and argue with the authorities, only one of them was trusted enough, understood enough, to be told what actually needed to happen next. And it wasn't Peter. It wasn't John, the disciple tradition says Jesus loved most. It was Judas. Bart Ehrman, a leading New Testament historian, contributed commentary to National Geographic's published edition of the text, background analysis mostly, helping situate it for a general audience rather than making the core translation call himself. But here's what actually kept me up at night when I first understood the implications. If this reading is right, even partially right, then everything hinges on a single English word most translations of the Gospels use without a second thought: betray. Elaine Pagels at Princeton, a scholar who has spent decades studying exactly this kind of text, points out that the underlying Greek word in the canonical Gospels, paradidomi, doesn't actually mean betray in any moralized sense at all. It means simply to hand over. It's the same verb used elsewhere in the New Testament for God handing over Jesus to the authorities as part of the divine plan. Somewhere in the translation history, in choices made by scribes and later by Bible translators working in Greek, then Latin, then English, that neutral verb, hand over, became the loaded, damning word we all grew up with. Betray. One word, judged and rejudged across 2,000 years until it hardened into an identity nobody thought to question anymore. Before I go further into where this gets complicated, because it does get complicated and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, I want to mention something. A lot of you ask me in the comments where you can go to actually read the source material yourself instead of just trusting a guy talking into a camera to summarize it accurately. I get that instinct. You should be skeptical. So I put together the actual research. Years of it. Organized, every source cited, walking through documents like this one in far more depth than a video can hold. It's linked in the pinned comment under this video. If that's something you want to go deeper into, I'm not going to keep bringing it up. I just think, given what we're about to get into, you deserve to know it exists. Now here's where I need to be honest with you, because a channel like this one only works if I tell you the parts that complicate the story too, not just the parts that make it cleaner. A year after National Geographic's translation dropped, a scholar named April DeConnick at Rice University went back to the original Coptic and said, essentially, you got it wrong. Not wrong about the text being ancient, not wrong about it being important. Wrong about what it actually says. DeConnick's argument centers on a single word again: I promise this is the last one, but it matters just as much as paradidomi did. The Coptic word in question is daemon. National Geographic's team translated it as spirit, a neutral, almost complimentary term in the context of the sentence. DeConnick went back through the broader corpus of Gnostic literature from the same period and found something the original team seemed to have missed or chosen not to emphasize. In that literature, daemon consistently means demon, not a friendly spirit guide, a demon. And the text, she points out, had access to a genuinely neutral Coptic word for spirit, pneuma, and didn't use it here. It used daemon. DeConnick organized a conference at Rice University in March of 2008 specifically to put this challenge in front of her peers. By most accounts, a significant number of the scholars in that room walked away agreeing with her. The original translation had, at minimum, softened something the Coptic text doesn't actually soften. So, which is it? Is Judas the most trusted disciple, chosen for a sacred mission? Or is Judas, in DeConnick's reading, something closer to a demon, an agent working for a flawed, lesser deity these Gnostic communities called saklas, not the true God at all? Which version do you even trust? The church that fought this idea from the 1st century, or the scientists who dug it out of a bank vault and immediately started fighting each other over what it actually says? Here's the detail that took me the longest to understand, and it's the one that actually matters more than either translation on its own. Look at what both readings agree on underneath their disagreement. Neither the 2006 translation nor DeConnick's 2007 correction restores the story any of us were taught in Sunday school. Neither one says Judas was a greedy opportunist who sold out his teacher on the spot for a bag of silver because the money was too good to pass up. In the National Geographic reading, Judas is following instructions from Jesus. In DeConnick's reading, Judas is a demon fulfilling his nature as an agent of a lesser god. But even that role, in Gnostic cosmology, is foreknown. Assigned. Written into the structure of the cosmos before Judas ever showed up to play his part. Heroic Judas or damned Judas? The scholars can keep fighting about that, and they have for nearly 2 decades now. But on the one point that actually undoes the version I taught in that Catholic school classroom, they don't disagree at all. This was not a spontaneous betrayal. It was not a crime of opportunity committed by a weak man who couldn't resist 30 coins. In every reading this manuscript supports, Judas's act was scripted, arranged, necessary to a plan that was already in motion before he ever raised his hand. That's not a fringe theory anymore. That's the floor both sides of a genuine ongoing academic argument are standing on. So if the scholars can't even agree on how heroic or damned Judas comes out looking, how did the church settle on one single, simple version and defend it for 2,000 years without so much as a footnote acknowledging the argument existed? Because it wasn't left to chance. It was locked down. Twice, on purpose. We already know the first lock. Irenaeus, writing around the year 180, naming this tradition and refuting it point by point. But refuting an idea and erasing it are 2 different acts, and the church needed both. The second lock came nearly 2 centuries later, and it's the one that actually did the erasing. In the year 367, Athanasius of Alexandria, one of the most powerful bishops in the Christian world at the time, wrote what's called his 39th festal letter. It is, as far as we know, the very first surviving document in history to list the exact 27 books that would become the New Testament as we know it today. Not roughly these books, not a general tradition, a fixed, finished, numbered list. And in that same letter, Athanasius drew a line around it. He explicitly warned that apocryphal texts, the exact category the Gospel of Judas fell into, ought not to be mingled with the scripture which is inspired by God. Mingled, as if the danger wasn't that these texts were false, but that they were close enough to true to be confused with it. 185 years after Irenaeus first wrote the Gospel of Judas's name into the historical record specifically to condemn it, Athanasius closed the door a second time, this time permanently, formally, canonically. Not a bishop arguing against a local heresy anymore. The literal boundary of Scripture itself, drawn to exclude it by name and by category for every Christian community that would ever come after. Two independent acts of institutional exclusion, nearly 2 centuries apart, both aimed at the same idea. That's not neglect. Documents get neglected by accident all the time. Copied less, translated less, quietly forgotten because nobody found them urgent. This is not that. This is a door closed once, checked, and closed again, harder, a lifetime later. And here's the part that actually convinced me this wasn't ancient history at all. This wasn't settled in the 4th century. It's still being fought over right now by men in the highest offices of the Church in our own lifetime. When the Codex Chaco surfaced in 2006, Pope Benedict XVI personally, publicly denied the text any credibility. Not a spokesperson, the Pope himself on the record. The Archbishop of Canterbury made a nearly identical statement, attributing the entire controversy to what he called the public's appetite for conspiracy theories, as if the manuscript itself, sitting in a lab in Basel being reassembled fragment by fragment, was somehow the fault of overeager readers rather than a genuine 2,000-year-old document. If the Church denounced this text by name within a century of Jesus' death, and a pope was still personally denying it in 2006, almost 2,000 years later, what exactly are they still protecting? A Vatican spokesman, Monsignor Walter Brandmüller, felt compelled to state publicly that the Church welcomes scrutiny of the manuscript, the kind of sentence institutions only say out loud when they suspect people think the opposite is true. A priest named Father Thomas Williams at a pontifical university in Rome was asked directly in an interview whether the Church had covered this up. He didn't dodge the question. He called it myths circulated by Dan Brown and numerous conspiracy theorists, which is, if you think about it for a second, a strange thing to say about a manuscript whose existence was documented by a Catholic bishop 18 centuries before Dan Brown was born. Within months of the 2006 broadcast, at least 4 separate Catholic publications, Catholic Culture, the National Catholic Register, Loyola Press, and the Center for Evangelization and Renewal, ran rebuttal pieces. One of them was titled, without apparent irony, "The Gospel of Judas is neither." Meaning, not a gospel, and not really about Judas in their assessment. I want you to notice what's actually happening here, because it's easy to miss if you're just listening for who's right. None of that response was necessary if the manuscript were the irrelevant, obviously fake curiosity these institutions kept insisting it was. Nobody writes 4 rebuttal articles and puts the Pope on the record about a document nobody takes seriously. You don't need the Archbishop of Canterbury personally addressing a non-starter. Institutions defend themselves, in print, under their own names, against ideas serious enough to threaten something. The denial isn't proof the theory is wrong. The denial is proof the question landed exactly where it was supposed to. So where does that leave us? Not with certainty. I want to be honest about that, because certainty is exactly the thing the canonical version had that this manuscript doesn't offer back. I'm not standing here telling you Judas was secretly a good man and the Church lied to your face for 2,000 years. That's not what the evidence supports, and it's not what I believe. Here's what the evidence actually supports, and it's stranger, and in some ways more unsettling, than either the hero story or the villain story. Within a century of the crucifixion, possibly less, there was already a documented, named, seriously enough regarded alternative tradition in which Judas's act was not betrayal in the moral sense we inherited. It was obedience to instructions he alone was trusted to receive. That tradition was significant enough that a bishop wrote a formal refutation of it by name around the year 180. It was significant enough that 185 years later, the man drawing the actual boundaries of Scripture excluded it specifically, by category, forever. And the physical evidence of that tradition survived, barely, improbably, against odds that should have destroyed it a dozen times over. Through looters, a bank vault in Long Island, a freezer that nearly finished what neglect started, a bankruptcy, and a race against physical decay that reduced it to nearly 1,000 fragments before anyone could read a full sentence of it again. And when it finally did surface, in 2006, it didn't resolve into a simple new story to replace the old one. It fractured into an argument scholars are still having. Judas the trusted insider, or Judas the demon fulfilling a role in a cosmic script neither reading treats as accident. Two different scholarly camps, one shared conclusion neither one backs away from. Whatever happened in that garden, it wasn't a weak man cracking under the weight of 30 coins. Here's my honest answer. The one I've landed on after years of sitting with this. Not the confident one I used to give teenagers in a classroom with a crucifix on the wall. I don't know if Judas was a hero. I genuinely don't. I'm not sure the ancient authors of this text were even trying to answer that question in the way we want them to. But I know, with total certainty now, that the simple story, greedy man, 30 coins, well-deserved damnation case closed, was never the only account that existed. It was the only account that was allowed to survive uncontested. There's a difference between those two things, and for most of my life, nobody had ever pointed that difference out to me. The church didn't spend 2,000 years proving Judas was guilty. Institutions rarely spend that much energy proving something that was never actually in doubt. They spent 2,000 years making sure you'd never have to ask the question this text asks in the first place. The silence wasn't the absence of an answer. The silence was the answer, dressed up as if there had never been a question at all. Go back to that bank in Hicksville for a second. 16 years in the dark, a lock that no longer turned, a key that had to be forced. Nobody put that box there to hide a secret forever. They just stopped looking. And when somebody finally did look again, it took a locksmith, a near-catastrophic freezer accident, a bankruptcy, and a restoration team spending years piecing together nearly 1,000 fragments just to get back to where the story could be told again. That's not a metaphor I'm reaching for. That's what actually happened, and it should make you wonder. The way it made me wonder. What else is sitting in an ordinary box somewhere? Not hidden, just forgotten, waiting for someone to notice the key doesn't turn. Everything you just watched. The bank vault, the freezer, a bishop's refutation from the year 180, a canon list from 367, two Ivy League caliber scholars still arguing about a demon versus a disciple. None of that came easy. It took weeks of chasing primary sources that don't show up on the first page of a search engine. That's the value I just handed you for free, same as always. This channel doesn't get funded to ask questions like this. The institutions with the money have very little interest in this particular kind of digging. So, if tonight's investigation actually meant something to you, if it's the kind of research you don't want to see disappear, there's a super thanks button right below this video. It's not a donation, it's closer to buying the next lock open, and if you use it, you're not just a viewer anymore. You're one of the people actually keeping this kind of investigation alive. Before you go, I want to know where you actually land on this. Not where you think you're supposed to land. Team Judas, the trusted insider, following instructions nobody else was given. Or Team Judas the demon, playing exactly the role a lesser god assigned him, no more heroic than the traitor version. Two very different readings of the same fragile manuscript. Drop your team in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious which version unsettles you more. And if you want the deeper version of this investigation, the full research behind tonight's video, every source laid out properly, it's linked in the pinned comment. No pressure, just there if you want it. I'll let you sit with that bank box and that locksmith and that key that wouldn't turn. You decide what to do with it.